Hi everyone! Thanks for stopping by writelikeawizard.com. I am author Kayan Lee, the creator of this blog, and I decided to do something different this year. I want to do video blogging. Video blogging is so much fun. And as a special treat, I'd like to do a reading from my book Thicker Than Blood. In Thicker Than Blood, you can find 4 short stories that are dark and twisted and creepy. So, let's start with Where is Emily, one of my favorites. Where is Katie? Emily sat on her 4-post bed. She clutched her doll to her chest and listened. Angry shouts filled the small house. She stared at her door with the blank look on her pale face. The door was boarded closed, locked from the outside, and chained. She heard her mother's screams vibrating through the house. Her mother pleaded for her father to stop. Emily jumped when she heard something crash. The screaming stopped. She leaned forward on her bed, held her breath, and listened. Silence. "Mama?" she whispered. No one replied. Emily sighed and picked up one of her dolls from her collection. Her room was incredibly clean, except for the mold that grew on her ceiling. Her bookcase was filled with old, used paperbacks and broken toys. All of Emily's porcelain dolls were neatly stacked on her bed. She held up her newest doll and smiled. Her face was beautiful. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, such a contrast from Emily's black hair and brown eyes. She clutched the doll to her chest and listened. She heard loud footsteps on the creaking floorboards outside her room. Emily could smell him. Her father had been drinking. He paused outside of her door and she tensed. She could hear him breathing. She stared at the doorknob waiting for him to turn it, but knew that he never would. She hadn't seen her father's face in years, nor her mother's. The footsteps continued down the hallway, and she heard a door slam. Emily hopped off of her bed and ran to the window. She caught the sight of his balding head as he got into his red pickup truck and sped down the rocky driveway, headed towards town. She stood there for a moment and watched the truck go up the hill and turn right onto the country roads. The grass and weeds were so high in the yard that it looked to Emily like a jungle. She opened her window to a hot breeze. Emily climbed to the ground, holding her doll's tiny arm. She had on her backpack. It was old and falling apart. She had stapled the straps back together and had sewn the zipper back in place. She began the long walk to the school in silence. She hummed to herself and to the doll and swung her along as she strolled up the driveway. Emily kicked rocks and gravel as she walked along. She blew the hot dust from before her. She heard the door open behind her. Emily paused and looked over her shoulder. She was surprised to see her mother standing in the doorway, staring at her. Emily thought she was dead. She guessed she had simply been knocked out for a time. The frail, short woman stood there with blood dripping from her head and onto her apron. Emily squinted. She couldn't make out the expression on her face. Then the door was slammed shut, without a word. Emily turned on her heels and continued her trek. What did she expect? She was almost 7 years old, and her mother and father hadn't spoken a word to her in years. She didn't forget their voices. She couldn't. Her mother and father argued every day. Emily spent all of her time alone in her room or playing in the countryside. School was an illusion. She would sit outside in a tree and watch the children play. Maybe once in a while a child her age would approach her, and she would convince them to come and play. Such moments were rare, but they were what Emily lived for. She continued to kick rocks with her dusty black shoes. She hummed and sang to herself songs that her mother used to sing when she was smaller, when she was still loved. Birds flew above her and she smiled, imagining that they were singing along with her. She remembered seeing a movie once. There was a beautiful girl with golden hair in the film. She sang outside her window, and the birds and the critters of the forest sang along and played with her as if they were friends. That vision stuck in her mind. One day, perhaps, she could be like that girl in the movie. Emily skipped with her eyes closed, feeling the sun warm her cold cheeks. She was always cold. She imagined a beautiful world behind her eyelids and smiled. Her smile faded when her stomach growled. It was a deep, gnawing nag within the pit of her stomach. Her stomach twisted upon itself, begging for food. Emily continued skipping. She could always steal an apple from Farmer Mac's garden. He never caught her. She thought he saw her one day, but he never said a word to her. Perhaps they had an unspoken understanding. Emily was broken from her thoughts when she heard a car approach. She moved aside when the rumbling grew louder behind her. Emily skidded to a stop just as the car did. Her face paled. She could feel his presence. He watched her. She knew he would be coming. She was ready. She turned to face the man in the car. His windows were tinted. She couldn't see his face, only his silhouette. She knew he was staring at her. She held the doll's hand tighter and pulled her into her chest, watching him. When he opened the car door, she sighed. Her shoulders slumped, but she never let her gaze falter. Then their eyes met. His were bloodshot and a bright blue. His bright blonde hair was wild and his clothes disheveled. She frowned. He looked different this time. He looked unstable. He towered over her and glared down at her. Emily didn't flinch when he reached for her. She was thrown over his shoulder and carried around to the back of his car. He popped the trunk and dropped her inside like a bag of coals. The door slammed shut, and she was left with nothing but darkness and the extreme heat. "Here goes," she said to the doll, and waited. That's just the beginning of Where is Katie? If you'd like to read more, you just have to purchase it on Amazon.com. It's only $1.99. Thank you guys for joining me today. It was so much fun. I know I made a couple of blips, but oh well. Have a great day.